I'm going to now welcome Steve Lakis, our president, to get us kicked off. Steve, take it away.
Thanks, Kate. Good afternoon, everybody. I think I know most of you on this call, but for those who I've not had the pleasure of meeting, my name is Steve Lakis, and I am the president of the State Legislative Leaders Foundation. Again, those of you who are members of our organization that participate know that our normal activity is to convene educational programs all over the country, all around the world, where we bring legislative leaders together with business leaders to talk about many of the critical public policy issues of the day. Well, we're certainly in a moment in history right now. And like all of you, the foundation is adapting to this new COVID world. Our goal still remains the same, to keep you connected with each other, with legislative leaders having the opportunity to share what their states are doing to respond to all the various aspects of the COVID crisis, and to the extent that we can to engage the members of our business community, to give them an opportunity to participate with the legislative leaders across the country in talking about these common concerns and issues. Today, we will be holding our second in a three-part series focusing on the economy. We entitled this series Strategies for Rebuilding and Strengthening Our State Economies. And it is a daunting task and will be a daunting task in the upcoming weeks and months as we progress through this virus and hopefully look toward restoring and rebuilding our economy in 2021 and beyond. To lead us in today's discussion, I have with us our good friend and colleague, Neil Austin, who serves as a senior consultant to Multi-State Associates and to the State Legislative Leaders Foundation. Many of you will know Neil from his previous experience. He was the director of the Washington, D.C. office of the National Conference of State Legislatures. And most importantly, at least when I read his impressive resume, Neil spearheaded a special task force committee appointed by NCSL, which was charged with interstate taxation of goods coming into states. And he was successful in enabling states to collect sales taxes on out-of-state transactions. And in a challenge before the Supreme Court, that position was sustained. So Neil has rich experience working with state and federal taxation policy, and he brings that abundance of knowledge to the Leaders Foundation and to these discussions. So without further ado, it's my pleasure and honor to introduce my good friend, Neil Austin.
Thanks, Steve. Thank you very much for that. I appreciate it. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Steve mentioned about this being our second webinar in a series of three. I just thought for those who may not have been there for the first webinar back in July, we had Dylan George, Vice President of InQtel, and an epidemiologist who provided an overview of the possible scenarios that the pandemic might take over the next 6 to 12 months. And Dan White, Director of Governmental Consulting and Public Finance at Moody's Analytics, who discussed the possible economic impacts of those pandemic scenarios. And it was quite alarming, to say the least. Today's session will provide an overview of the fiscal conditions of state governments after almost 7 months of enduring COVID-19, how state governments have responded so far, how this all compares to what states did during the Great Recession, and what options states may want to consider to close budget gaps and revive their economies over the next few years. We'll hear from our two presenters first, and then have about 30 minutes for Q&A. I would ask that should you have a question during the presentations, please click the Q&A tab located at the bottom of your screen and then write in your question. Thank you. Our first presenter this afternoon is Kim Rubin, the Saul Price Fellow and Director of the State and Local Finance Initiative at the Urban Brookings Tax Policy Center. Rubin is an expert on state and local public finance. Her work focuses on state budget and tax issues, intergovernmental relations, fiscal institutions, and the economics of education. including federal and state financing of both K through 12 and post-secondary education. Ruben has testified before state legislatures across the country about economic conditions and tax policy. Ruben is also an adjunct fellow at the Public Policy Institute of California and has served as an adjunct professor at the Georgetown University Public Policy Institute and the Goldman School of Public Policy at the University of California, Berkeley. Kim, would like to begin?
Yes, thank you. And thank you for having me. And I am going to try and share my screen and we'll see if this works. And so I thought PowerPoint was up. So I'm going to go to slideshow. Is that working?
Not yet. Good.
Wait. Okay.
You can click play from start.
Okay. Excellent. I'm going to assume don't save. Ooh. Okay. That was bad. Okay, so my screen sharing has stopped. Is that correct?
It has. Yep.
All right, we're gonna start over. We're gonna share screen, and then we're gonna go to PowerPoint. And in a minute, I am gonna let Kate do this. And
Just let me know
why this is not working. Why? Okay, this is my desktop. So okay, why don't I just have you do it?
Yep. Okay.
I understand why this is share. Oh, wait, did that work or is that you?
It did. It worked.
Okay, excellent. So I am Kim Rubin. I work at the Urban Institute. I work in a group called the Tax Policy Center, which is a joint effort between the Urban Institute and Brookings Institution. Within there, I also direct the state and local finance initiative. I'm going to be presenting a lot of information, including a lot of figures and updates on things. Most of this is available on our website. The other thing that I just sort of want to talk about from the beginning, wait, I need to go to slideshow.
Click play from start.
Play from start, excellent, okay. That just took way longer than it should. So a lot of this stuff I'm talking about, you can also find on our website. We also have something that might be interesting if you're curious about what's going on in another state. In that one of the things we did is we put together some fiscal briefs, which are basically, I like to think of them as our cheat sheets for states. So basically gives me and the people I work with, if we need to know something about Montana or Illinois, some basic information, including what's going on with their budget. And so if you ever are curious or you're thinking about what's going on in a state, that might be something that could be useful as you're going forward. So what I'm going to talk about today are the state of state budgets and sort of what fiscal problems look like and what was done in the Great Recession. And so first I'm going to give you the bottom line of what my message is, and then if you have questions, happy to go over everything. So the first thing I think it's important to note, and you all know this probably better than everybody else, is states were actually in pretty good shape before COVID-19. Most states started the year in really good shape. They didn't have any problems. The fiscal problems are deep and widespread, but the severity varies a lot depending on a couple of different things. So some of it depends on your economy and what you're relying on, what your tax system is, and most critically, what your viral caseload is like. Something that was good in the spring was congressional assistance had helped, but the fact that it's expiring, and even though I never would have predicted it in the past, the fact that we haven't passed another stimulus bill is sort of problematic. As we move forward, what we try to recommend states to do is to do a number of things. You don't want to balance your budget or make all the changes either on the tax side or the budget side. And so using some combination of tax increase, budget cuts, relying on federal aid and rainy day funds can help temper the responses you have to make states took substantial actions in 2020. Some of it actually turned out to be less bad than they were expecting, but things are going to be worse in 2021. You've heard this all from Dan before. And then something that I like pointing out is that the uncertainty is huge and it's a persistent problem. And so the fact that we don't necessarily know a lot of things, we don't know what the viral load is going to look like, we don't know what's going to happen with the economy, states don't know whether the federal government is going to actually pass additional assistance, makes this all really tough. It was a really hard summer where states were trying to pass budgets when they didn't necessarily know what the extent of the problem was going to be, what their revenues were going to be because all of their income taxes were delayed, and then also whether there was going to be federal assistance or changes going forward. So what did they look like before? So I said this before, state revenues were on track for a 10th consecutive year. No states, so part of how you can tell that states were in pretty good shape is no one was forced to make a mid-year budget cut the year before, and most states actually passed budgets on time or early for the last fiscal year. Median rainy day funds were 7.3% of expenditures. They were expected to be 7.8%, and there was $75.5 billion across all states in rainy day fund revenues. This is compared to 4.6%, which is sort of the amount of money states had on hand before the Great Recession, so at the end of fiscal year 2007. And so if we just think about it in comparison, you were in much better shape overall. There were variations across states. Not all states were in good shape, but it was an easier place to be. And so this is all just showing that we were forecasting revenue growth going forward in most states, in most types of revenue sources. And what does it look like now? So the first thing to note is this is not a typical recession. So this is a chart that we keep updating weekly, showing how many unemployment insurance claims there have been as of whatever the Thursday is of this week. So this is September 17th, starting in mid-March. And so the fact that we are right now at almost 56 million claims in the United States, and that it basically only took 12 weeks to hit the number of claims that was over the entirety of the Great Recession. And so the other lines, not the yellow lines, are the levels of claims in the last 3 recessions. And part of this is just highlighting how much faster and more extreme this recession was compared to them. And then if we look at this compared to what it looks like compared to the Great Recession, so that big lump, which had been the largest amount of unemployment rates. So the first one was unemployment compensation claims. This is unemployment rates. And so basically the first lump is basically showing you what the highest unemployment rate was in the Great Recession, but that was dwarfed by what we saw in March. And even now, as you go forward, in about 10 states, we're still above what the maximum unemployment rate was during the Great Recession. And so even though unemployment rates have come down as we've started opening up the economy, and this is going to vary a lot across different states, it's still really high in Hawaii, for example. It is lower than the maximum for most states, but there are probably about a dozen states that still have unemployment rates that are higher than the highest rate it was during the Great Recession. And so partly what we saw in general this spring was that there was a decline in what was purchased by individuals and businesses. The one notable exception was food. So for states that actually taxed or had a sales tax on food, that helped maintain some of the revenues for those states. But in general, spending fell. And we saw revenue forecasts collapse. And so basically we have information comparing what the revenue forecasts were for 2020 and 2021 before COVID-19 in 27 states. And basically the updated forecasts versus where they were before are much lower. And if we aggregate that and hypothesize to 50 states, that would be about $200 billion. And so that is lower than, say, Moody's is forecasting, but this is based on sort of what state budget officers are seeing and how they change their forecasts. And again, a lot of this is going to depend critically on what we see and what's happening within your state. So states that are more dependent on tourism and energy are worse off than other states. And so Hawaii is seeing a pretty big decline in their revenue estimates, Colorado, New Mexico, California, Wyoming. So some of this has to do with the level of COVID-19, and some of this has to do with the economic activity that goes on in that state. And so this is just basically showing for some states how much revenue declines are forecast in 2020, so the year that ends, versus fiscal year 2019. And we saw in Connecticut that there was a 12% decline in state revenues for the fiscal year compared to the fiscal year before. California is like 9%. Tennessee hasn't seen that big a decrease in its revenue declines for the year, in part because its economy has actually been doing pretty well relatively recently. And we've seen, this is comparing a different thing. This is comparing March through July for 2020 versus 2019. And so rather than comparing fiscal year to fiscal year, this is basically including that period when everything sort of declined. In part, the reason that the fiscal year wasn't as bad for 2020 as you could have imagined was the fact that we shut everything down in March. So it was really just that last quarter of the fiscal year that saw these declines in revenue. So a lot of the revenue was there. In part of what we're doing is looking at March through July, in part because where that July money shows up, especially where that income tax revenue that was delayed until July, that would have been seen in April, is really important. So when we just do comparisons of what one month looks like compared to that month the year before, things look really odd because of that shifting in money, especially in the personal income tax. The other thing to note is even though revenues are down, there also is increased need for spending. And so not only are there going to need to be spending cuts in sort of what business as usual is in your state, there are going to be need for increased spending in certain areas. Most notably, the public health emergency means that there was increased need for testing, PPE, hospital expenses are all going to be high. Because people have lost their jobs and there are healthcare expenses, some colleagues of mine at Urban have estimated that the non-elderly Medicaid enrollment is going to increase by 8 to 26 million people during the COVID-19 pandemic. And so some of that is that need for additional healthcare and the fact that if people have lost their jobs, they no longer qualify for insurance through their company. And then the other thing we saw, and some of this has started sorting itself out, over the summer in education, school districts were needing to prepare for both in-person and online learning. So they simultaneously needed to figure out what added expenses they needed to provide kids with more space if they were going into the schools, and then also how do they have the technology that they need if they're going to be doing this remotely. So again, a lot of this is a lot of uncertainty that you've had to face as you were passing your budgets and moving forward, and a lot of this still exists as we don't know what the fall is going to look like. And so 46 states began their fiscal year on July 1st. We've seen some of this sort of sort itself out. A number of states, like New Jersey, basically just determined that its budget year was going to start later. But then a number of states, especially in New England, basically passed budgets on a short-term basis. So they basically said that they were going to continue their funding and then come and reevaluate what things looked like 3 months in or 4 months in. And ideally, the hope was that there would be some new federal aid package that could help soften the blow and any changes that needed to be in. The other thing that was interesting as we sort of saw the numbers come in this year, especially those July numbers for a number of states, Vermont, I think Alabama was in this category, Ohio may have been, they actually saw more money come in July. So those income tax revenues were actually higher than they were anticipating. They were lower than what they were first forecasting, but they were higher than their updated forecasts. And so there were a number of states that were able to get through the end of 2020 without tapping their rainy day funds, knowing that they're going to need that money going into the next year and the years coming forward. And part of the reason that things were less bad in my mind was the fact that the federal government actually did respond in March fairly quickly and in a way that was effective. The fact that they passed things that sort of increased money for states and their local governments to sort of address the public health response, the fact that there was more money and they increased the FMAP, so the match for Medicaid funds. And then there was money that was put in to help with corona relief spending for education and for other areas. Part of what's hard is a lot of that money is supposed to be related only to the specific costs related to the pandemic, not any of the revenue changes that states have experienced. Now, some of those rules have actually been loosened as we've moved forward, but there also has been, a call to use some of that money to sort of expand the unemployment insurance. Something else that was incredibly helpful for states was that bonus in unemployment money that ran out or ended this summer. So that $600 added payment actually softened some of what we saw on the revenue side for states. And then the fact that it's been replaced with a $300 benefit that has been slow in getting implemented has made this hard. The other thing that, my view from Washington is we kind of, if you had asked me over the summer, I would have said absolutely we would have seen a bill that would have given some assistance to state and local governments, especially given it was an election year. The House was asking for $3 trillion. It seemed like we might get less money in there. The fact that nothing has been passed has made this really hard. So it doesn't seem like we're going to see anything happening in Washington before the election at this point. Whereas if you had asked me a week or two ago, I would have thought that they may have included something that seemed like more assistance as part of the continuing resolution for their budget problems. State actions thus far, states have been spending down their rainy day funds, but most are aware that there's worse yet to come. So Nevada, I think, has mainly spent much of that money. Tax actions have been limited thus far. What we did see is there was some change in, especially on the corporate side, what rules look like for corporate income taxes to try and let companies keep more of their money through changing things like net operating loss rules and carryback rules. Many states decoupled from that so they could keep some of that corporate income tax money and not see some of the hits that the federal government is going to see in terms of declines in amended corporate tax rates. We saw fiscal year 2020 budget cuts. Some of that was temporary. We saw some furloughs and some layoffs. Some of this, again, may have been to take advantage of the fact that there was that $600 bonus payments and recognizing the fact that if the whole economy is shut down, it might be prudent to not have some expenses at the state level if people aren't working. And so some of this could be a shift. Some states saw across the board thing where others saw some stuff that was targeted, and we're going to see even larger cuts. In a lot of the budgets that have been passed, we saw language in there talking about what other cuts were going to be needed or what spending was not going to be restored if there wasn't federal assistance. And again, mostly we saw this show up in prior recessions. We saw delays in terms of when we saw cuts in state and local government employment. We saw much larger cuts sooner. So if you look at that little black line at the very front, that's basically this recession. And then the others basically just show you how state and local employment has changed over time. If we look across states, we see that state and local government employment is down 1.2 million positions, or 6.2% since February. This is as of July. That number was even higher earlier. So we had seen 1.5 million in positions cut, including some of the temporary layoffs, but we saw some of those positions get restored. You can imagine that some of that has to do with opening up the schools and opening things back up. But the fact that we still see a 6.2% decline overall since state and local employment in February means that this has all been earlier than what we saw in prior recessions. And so what did we learn from the Great Recession, and what actions can there be? So during the Great Recession, it was actually a time when the federal government was actually very effective at helping states in terms of getting money out. And so there was a lot of federal aid. Most notably, there was an increase in the federal match for Medicaid, which meant that that relieved some state budgets. There was also a fair amount of money that went for K-12 education. If you think that much of what state and local governments, especially state governments from the general fund, spend money on, it is largely healthcare, Medicaid spending, and education. So by getting money out targeted at those areas and using existing formulas, it was a very effective way during the Great Recession for the federal government to get money out. Now, it came with some strings that made it a little harder. But other actions that we saw is we did see states spend down their rainy day funds. We saw there be some shift or deferring of spending. We did see some action where people were moving things from special funds into general fund revenues. Part of this, we could see something where if people were going to do investment in infrastructure out of actual on-hand revenues, they shifted some of that into bonding. We did see some budget cuts and some tax or revenue increases. In general, when we talk to states about what's happening, we try and encourage them to use some combination of things. So trying not to make it all on the budget side or all on the tax side. One of the things that we also see happen, and this happens from the federal level to states and then states to local governments, we often see there be a cut in local aid and pushing some of the responsibility down, which is hard because as you go down, there's less flexibility in going forward. Partly in some work I did, and somebody should let me know if I am getting close to what my time limit is. I did some work with a couple of colleagues at Urban where we looked at how states responded in real time to unexpected deficits. And so this is work using data from the National Association of State Budget Officers, and that we termed with information about fiscal institutions in place. And we looked at whether, when faced with unexpected deficits, did states increase taxes, cut spending, or just not respond? So do something that was outside of the general fund through either using other funds or using things like rainy day funds or using money from the federal government. And so this is work that was based on a report that was originally done by Jim Paterba in 1994. Truth be told, this was the first project I worked on when I was a graduate student. So it's near and dear to my heart. And so basically what we're doing is we're looking at sort of if states have deficits and surpluses, and they have balanced budget rules, tax and expenditure limits, and then we also look at what happened with party control. What does it mean for sort of what they did in terms of spending cuts and tax increases? And so the first thing to note is that things look really different in earlier recessions, so the recessions in the 1990s and early noughts, than they did during the Great Recession. So for $100 in unexpected shortfall in those earlier periods, we saw about 60% balance through tax increases or budget cuts. That number went down in this more recent period. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that states started with rainy day fund money, and also the fact that the federal government, by taking on some of the responsibilities, especially with medical and Medicaid, meant that states had some flexibility to cut less. These numbers look different depending on if you had strong balanced budget rules or weak balanced budget rules. So in general, states in this later period who had strong rules still ended up cutting almost as much money and did a fair amount of it from budget cuts rather than tax increases. And we saw much less action going on in weak balanced budget rules in this later period. We saw similar patterns where things look different, but depending on whether you had a revenue limit in place or an expenditure limit. So revenue limits basically say you can only increase taxes by a certain amount per year. So Tabor in Colorado would be an example of that. Spending limits say that spending can only go up by X amount. There are places that have one or the other, some have both. And again, what that looked like across what rules are in place varied a lot. So something that was different this time, and that it's important to note, and something that we weren't necessarily expecting, but seemed to drive a lot of our results, is we also moved from having a lot of states that either had divided government, where you had a governor and one house of one party, and the other house or the different level of government of the other party. We went from a lot of divided government in that early period to having much more unified Republican control in the period since the Great Recession. And what we actually found, and can you guys see it? I'm like, some of this is hidden by, oh, I need to go back, by the list on my things. But we actually found that for divided government and unified democratic government, we saw this $60 change. And it didn't look that different between whether you had all Democrats in power or if you had some mixed thing. But if you were totally Republican controlled, you were much less likely to increase taxes, which isn't necessarily surprising if we think about what the rhetoric is and what sort of the policy goals might be. But it is interesting that there was less of a response in terms of trying to balance your budget. And so what we took from this all and what we've done looking at what happened during the last recession is there was less of a reaction in the Great Recession than prior recessions, in part because of federal aid and rainy day funds. The recovery was long and weak. So something that it's important to keep in mind as you go forward. In a lot of states, you didn't necessarily recover, or you just recovered the level of education and healthcare spending you saw to levels in real terms that were in place before the Great Recession. We saw a lot of cut and reform for employee benefits. Some of this was on pension funds, but we also saw a movement to making employees contribute more to these funds. And there was some opportunity for reform. So part of what we saw in some of those job losses we saw did reflect a move to automation, where things like, if you think about the DMV, so some of what we saw in some of the cuts actually could have been beneficial as different systems were put in place that I think people actually kind of liked. On the revenue side, we actually saw a difference between states. So we saw some states introduce progressive income taxes while others cut taxes after the recovery came into place, if we think about this as a New York versus Kansas story. In work I've done with Bill Gale, we haven't seen much evidence that changing the structure, so moving away from the income tax, actually increases economic growth in states. We also saw states increase tobacco taxes and increase fees and charges, something to keep in mind as we're moving forward and thinking about options for reform. Tax increases are hard. They were always hard. The other thing to note, in the Great Recession, we did see things like hotel taxes or car taxes go up, or taxes on car rentals or restaurant meals. That's going to be really hard, and it's not necessarily going to be that effective if we think about where the economy is hurting right now. In some of the work we're doing on the ground in a couple of states, we're seeing states thinking about how to expand their sales taxes. Are there services that can be taxed? Are there things that as the economy changes that states should be considering to broaden back out their tax base, given that a lot of the economic activity right now is no longer covered by the sales tax base as we've moved from goods to services. As you think about what is appropriate for you to do, thinking about what it means and how your tax system compares to your neighbors or your competitors is important. One thing that I think is important to keep in mind is a lot of what we've seen in this recovery has been very K-shaped. So people like me who can just sort of start working at home and they haven't lost their jobs are doing much better than some of the lower wage workers who have basically been laid off. And so there might be opportunities for introducing higher tax rates at the top, or doing something that broadens your brackets in some way that can recognize the fact that not everybody is hurting. And so for people who have actually maintained their income over the COVID-19 period, it might be a little less painful if you're trying to get tax revenue from them. One of the things we're also seeing is states are expanding or legalizing and taxing marijuana for non-medical use. That is something we see more and more states doing, but it's not going to raise a large amount of money. So in general, we see that for states that have legalized and are taxing marijuana, it's about 0.5%, so less than 1% of their general revenue is being raised from these fees or taxes. And then cigarette taxes and alcohol taxes are always a place where people see things. On the spending side, there were things that you can do that are not necessarily broad-based cuts. There could be delays in spending. You can shift things across accounts. This isn't something we generally encourage people to do. But if you're trying to recognize the fact that balanced budget rules make it hard and make cuts especially painful when they're most needed, it might be, if you're a state that has been, say, paying into your pension fund or doing a lot of infrastructure spending from annual revenues rather than bonding, it might make sense to do some shifting across things like that. In general, we're encouraging places to try and be thoughtful and think about targeted cuts rather than across-the-board cuts, just because some of those can hurt different groups more than others. The other thing that becomes really important as we're thinking about cuts, especially when we're thinking about some of the ramifications of the pandemic, is thinking about how cuts in one department can actually affect costs in another department. So some of what we saw in sort of closing down our court system can increase jail costs and increase things in terms of sentences in prisons in a way that can be really harmful if we think about where the pandemic is spreading. And so there might be some incentive and opportunity for reform. So thinking about what might be programs that might be worth saving on the criminal justice side, there are some relatively cheap neighborhood engagement programs that have been shown to be effective, and cutting them might be politically easier because it is a smaller set of people lobbying for it, but they could be some of the things that might be most effective at trying to keep people out of prisons, especially if we think that the cost of having more people in our jails or prisons can be really high. And then the other thing to point out, and largely this is something that we highlight when we're talking to people at the federal level, it's really important to note that, you know, state and local governments not only contribute in terms of helping with this safety net and providing services to people, state and local governments are a big part of real GDP growth. So to the extent that there is drag coming from there needing to be layoffs or tax increases on the government side or cuts, that's going to affect the recovery and is going to slow down the economy overall. And on that cheery note, I will stop. This is information where you can contact me, and we have more information, and we're keeping track of what's going on as states release information. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim. Our next presenter is Yair Listikin. He's the Shibley Family Fund Professor of Law at Yale Law School. His scholarship studies tax law, corporate law, bankruptcy law, contract law, and the law of central banking. His research emphasizes a macroeconomic perspective that differs dramatically from the microeconomic perspective that dominates law and economics. In his 2019 book, Law and Macroeconomics, Legal Remedies to Recessions, Professor Listikin argues that law offers an underdeveloped but desperately needed tool for stabilizing depressed economies when monetary and fiscal policy prove inadequate. Professor Listikin has been honored with the Milton Friedman Fellowship from the Becker Friedman Institute at the University of Chicago and served as a visiting professor at Columbia Law School, Harvard Law School, and NYU School of Law. His research has been featured in the Wall Street Journal, Fortune, CNN.com, the Boston Globe, and Vox. Yair, would you like to begin?
Yes, thanks so much to you, Neil, and to SSLF for having me. I'm going to share my screen, and then we will, can people see this?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. Great.
Thank you.
So as I said, what I'm going to be doing here is trying to give all of you a few ideas for how you can mitigate the economic fallout from this incredible recession that we're all dealing with, while recognizing that balanced budget requirements make that incredibly difficult. So I'm going to give 3 ideas for right now, and then 1 idea for the future. So the 3 ideas for the present, just to give you a sense, is 1 is to reform experience rating of unemployment insurance taxation, which probably is going to raise unemployment starting next year. A second one is a reform of utility regulation so that it no longer makes recessions even worse. For reasons that I'll show you. And finally, just a pleading that states don't stop investing or making other expenditures that are not subject to the balanced budget requirements. So that's for the present. For the future, for the long-term future, I'll also throw out a couple of possible reforms, not eliminations, but reforms to balanced budget requirements that may give all of you more flexibility the next time we're in, hopefully not a mess like this, but the inevitable next recession. So moving on. Just want to give you the briefest sort of description of macro policy. Basically all you need to know. In the short run, and even in the medium run, especially at times like this when interest rates are 0, depressed spending leads to and causes unemployment. So the economy could produce more, but it's not producing more because no one wants to buy stuff. There's a shortage of aggregate demand. What that means is that in a situation like this, in a recession, we want, as policymakers, we want to think of ways to raise spending, both directly by raising government spending and or indirectly by getting the private sector to spend more, either by lowering their taxes or through other mechanisms that will also raise their spending. So that's what we do in recessions. Now, this costs money, it raises deficits. So during booms, when the economy is more at danger of overheaving than it is suffering from a shortage of employment opportunities and growth, we want to do the opposite. We want to pay it down. Now, that's sort of the classic sort of short run intro macro story that people have been sharing for many, many years. This is almost impossible for states because of balanced budget amendments. So balanced budget requirements more generally. It's very, very hard to raise spending and lower taxation if your revenue has gone down and you actually either have to lower spending or raise taxation in order to make your budget more balanced. So I'm just going to accept that as a given for most of this talk. And I'm going to try to say that, yes, that is true, but there's still quite a number of things that states can do that will help promote really private sector spending and private sector employment in the economy that will help mitigate the magnitude of the recession, even though the budget is still going to be balanced. So I will, and the key theme here is just, even though it's hard to make things much better, at a minimum, we want state policy to avoid making recessions worse. I'll give you 3 examples here in the book, which I have the friendly cover on the slide here. There are many, many more, and I'm very happy to speak with any of you or your staffs about other ideas. So 3 ideas to avoid making recession worse. First idea is reform experience rating of unemployment insurance taxation. That's a mouthful. What is experience rating? Experience rating is the idea that, that the amount any business pays in unemployment insurance payroll taxes, which are kind of jointly determined by the states and the federal government, the amount that they pay, it reflects how likely they are to have employees who will use unemployment insurance. So basically, the more an employer lays people off, the higher their unemployment insurance taxes. And just like a risky driver is probably going to pay more in auto insurance, so too a risky employer is going to pay more in unemployment insurance taxes. Why do we do this? Well, it's kind of, I think it's pretty intuitive to why we do this. If you are the type of employer who's going to be regularly calling on the unemployment insurance tax, then we want to give you a disincentive to do that. And we want you to internalize some of the costs, that what are called fiscal externalities, the costs that you're imposing on everyone else and their unemployment insurance taxes by raising the number of people who are claiming unemployment insurance taxes. And because that has to be paid for, that is ultimately raising unemployment insurance taxation rates. So I think it's relatively intuitive why we do it. The problem is, and in an ordinary year, if you ask me who should pay higher unemployment insurance taxes, I would say that the companies that are more likely to use it. So I think experience rating normally makes good sense, very good sense. And some form of experience rating is required by the federal unemployment statutes, although there's a lot of flexibility in there. But right now, or actually starting in next year, this is going to cause a massive problem. Why is it going to cause a very important problem? So if you look at this figure right here, you can see that in recessions, a lot of people get laid off. That's the definition of a recession. What this means is, in the immediate aftermath of a recession, every employer's experience rating goes up, which means that in the immediate aftermath of recessions, it is more expensive than ever for a business to hire, because they're going to pay much higher unemployment insurance payroll taxes than they would at some other time. So precisely when we want firms to be doing more hiring, we're making it more expensive than it ever is to do that. And just to give you a sense, there are some very good empirical papers estimating the size of this problem. My favorite paper, which looks at Florida's program, estimates that in 2010 and 2011, so just after the worst of the Great Recession, while unemployment was still quite elevated, about 12% of unemployment in Florida was due to really high unemployment insurance taxes. And this is, it's not a problem this year, because this year's experience ratings reflect last year's employer hiring or firing decisions. But starting next year, every employer is going to be facing, every employer that's laid anyone off, which is to say most employers, they're going to be facing much higher unemployment insurance taxes. That's going to create a disincentive for them to hire and will probably raise unemployment. So the first thing we can do to avoid making unemployment worse next year is to reform experience rating. Basically, what we want to do is we want to focus on your risk relative to your peers, but not your risk over the business cycle. So one thing, like, for example, I know the state of Connecticut has done is a functionally suspended experience rating for a certain amount of time, kind of reflecting the fact that if you're a restaurant and you laid people off when you were closed, that's not the type of thing that we want to be making it more expensive for you to hire next year on. So again, this is really considerable. We want to basically avoid this pattern. We don't want average tax rates to go up precisely when we want firms to be hiring. So there are a number of ways. I'm happy to talk in detail about how that can be paid for, but I just want to. This is a way right now. Our locked-in policy will make the recession worse next year. It'll make unemployment higher in your state. To the extent we can avoid that, we should. Another way in which state policy usually makes recessions worse is the way we currently conduct utility regulation. So how do, and this is state policy. So state public utility commissions, what do they do? Well, to a first approximation, what they do is they more or less guarantee utilities a rate of return that in practice is usually about 10%. So what does that mean? So, or how does that interact with a recession? So what that means is, well, first of all, let me say, why do we do it this way? We do it this way because we know utilities are natural monopolies. It's not easy to, we need to regulate them, but we want to make sure that there's a certain amount of, that we get the capital needed to fund the utilities that, that all of us need. So a stable and relatively high rate of return of 10% for that level of stability is a good way to draw capital into the sector, the capital that we need in order to fund investment in utilities. So that's why we do it. How does this interact with recessions? So what it does is, what happens in a recession? What happens in a recession is that utility demand, be it electricity demand, be it demand for heating, name your utility, cable TV, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Demand for all of these things goes down, just as people cut back. People do consume much less electricity and various other things. So they consume less, businesses consume less electricity. In addition, the number of delinquencies on utility bills goes well up because more and more people just don't have enough money to pay. So what does this mean for the utility? This means a utility typically has very high fixed costs. While the amount of electricity, say, consumed goes down, the utilities costs don't go down all that much. They still have to maintain the lines, they still have to have the power plants or solar panels or whatever it is however they're producing. So their costs stay roughly the same, their revenues go down, their rate of return goes down. They go to the regulator, they say to the regulator, our rate of return has gone down, we're supposed to get a 10% rate of return. And by and large, the regulator says, yes, you should be able to raise your prices in order to get your rate of return. The increase in prices will help compensate you for the increase in delinquencies and for the decrease in demand. So if you look at the chart I am showing right here, you will see that over the last two recessions, we see a marked spike in utility prices, basically like midway through the recession. Now, this is terrible stabilization policy. This makes recession worse. We all need our utilities. When our state regulator allows the utility to raise prices, it cuts our discretionary income. It's the functional equivalent of a tax increase. And if you're in the, let's say, the bottom half of the population, where who have the highest tendency to spend out of each additional dollar in discretionary income, then utilities are actually more important for you than income taxes. So basically what we're functionally doing with our utility regulation is we are raising utility prices we are raising taxes for the most vulnerable, for the people who are most likely to spend at precisely the time we want them doing the most spending, at precisely the time that spending is at a shortage. That's really bad policy. Now, of course, we are protecting the utilities, but I'd submit to you that utilities are actually quite able to access capital markets to maintain their spending. They can borrow. They can borrow in public markets. They can borrow in all sorts of places, so they are much better able to bear recession risk than the median utility consumer. So what should we do about this? So what I argue for in the book is what I call countercyclical utility regulation. So what we would do is, in recessions now, we would hold utility returns down. We could hold them down, let's say, to zero. That doesn't sound like fun. The utilities will not like it. But again, zero doesn't sound like that bad of a return in this day and age. A lot of firms are making much worse than zero. The market won't be like, oh my God, they're making a zero return. So we hold rates down now. We basically put more money in consumers' pockets. We raise spending. We lower unemployment. We mitigate the size of the recession without having to deficit spend at the state level. Now, this doesn't come free. We need to make sure that capital stays in the utility sector. What we need to do is, if we hold utility rates down to zero, rates of return down to zero now, we need to give them more than 10%, potentially considerably more than 10% when we're out of this mess, when incomes recover, when spending is less tight. If we give them an average return of 10%, or perhaps to compensate for them for this risk a little bit more, then utilities should be fine. They're still guaranteed their rate of return. Instead of guaranteeing their rate of return year after year, we guarantee their rate of return over the course of the business cycle, which for a business with ready access to capital is not that much of an imposition. Every other business handles recession risk. Only utilities are insulated from it. They're insulated from it not because of something special about utilities themselves, but rather we insulate them, we insulate their investors by putting it on the backs of the median utility consumer, who again is very likely to spend it. Here again, the state of Connecticut, it's not a coincidence that I live in Connecticut. The state of Connecticut has introduced a bill to instruct regulators to their utility commission to hold down rates now, and again, to increase regulatory goodwill so that utilities are basically promised their rate of return. So the point here is not to make life worse for the utilities. That's a sure way in the long run to avoid to prevent utility investment. But at least in the short run, it's a really good way to, in the long run, utilities get their money. They should be fine. But recessions become a bit worse in a meaningful way. This could be worth, depending on if we add up all the states together, potentially this could be a couple $100 billion in stimulus. So something really significant. Third thing for the short run is to plead with you, don't stop investing. The balanced budget requirements, as you well know, apply to your sort of ongoing spending, but not to your investment. You can issue bonds for investments. Now, in spite of this, government investment tends to go down in recessions. And as you can see from my chart here, real spending sorry about that. Real spending on utility, real spending on real government investment, so like infrastructure and things like that, plunged after the last recession. This is totally understandable if you are a state that's just trying to find money wherever you can, and there's some leakiness between infrastructure investment and ongoing spending. But from a business cycle perspective, it is a disaster. A recession is a great time to invest. Interest rates are really low. People are out of work. You can probably get infrastructure investment on the cheap. And you'll raise spending, you'll mitigate the recession, you'll lower unemployment in your state. So I just want to implore you, don't stop investing. This is within your statutory powers right now, your constitutional powers. It's just really, really hard to do. But you can see that actually in the dot-com recession, states managed pretty well. They kept up investment. It really was after the Great Recession that that investment plunged to all of our detriment. Now I will say, okay, so those are three short-run options, namely reform experience rating of unemployment insurance. Second, to reform utility regulations so that we don't raise rates at precisely the absolute worst time. And three, not to cut investment spending, state and local investment spending to the bone. So those are things we can do right now that will make recessions less bad. While if we do what we did in the Great Recessions, we'll actually be making it worse, as Kim indicated in her discussion. But as Kim also indicated, there's one of the big obstacles to more effective state policy, state fiscal policy in this area is balanced budget requirements. So just about every state, as Kim can tell you, that 94 paper is really looking at the effects of balanced budget requirements, as is her more recent work on that she presented for you today. Lots of states have balanced budget requirements. They are imperfectly effective, but still they do quite a bit. Why do we do it this way? I think we all kind of get why we do it this way. There is a fear of responsible spending, and that makes a lot of sense. We kind of want to what the population wants to hold the legislature's feet to the fire and say, you need to balance your budget, focus your mind. Okay, we understand that. Unfortunately, right now, as I indicated earlier, that leads to really bad policy. With states and localities cutting to the bone at precisely the time when, from a social perspective, from a policy perspective, we want them to increase spending. So unfortunately, this is, unless you just suspend your balanced budget requirements, this is not something that's going to fix the straits you're in now. If you can just get rid of your balanced budget requirements, well, then you can deficit spend and the world looks very different. I'm going to imagine, because in many cases this is constitutional, that that's really difficult. But what can we do over the long run so the next time this happens, you're not in the predicament you are in right now? A couple of things we can do. One is we could modify the balanced budget requirements. The ultimate modification is to say we don't have them. But they're there for a reason, so I'm hesitant to do that. A way of doing this that's a little bit of having our cake and eating it too is to allow for cyclically adjusted balanced budget requirements. So what that means is when a state is running at its potential output, at the level of unemployment that we think is like its long run average, then functionally they either have to have a balanced budget or need to be running surpluses. So most of the time, a cyclically balanced budget requirement is still going to hold states' feet to the fire. What it does mean is that if we think the state economy is well below its potential, then a state could run a deficit. What that would mean is now, because in just about every state, unemployment is way above its long run average. A cyclically adjusted balanced budget requirement would enable states to be running deficits now without just saying anything goes every which year and runaway spending is permissible. Of course, it's hard to figure out what the natural level, what the long run level of unemployment in the state is or could be, but it's not that hard. Many places, the IMF does this globally. The EU uses things like this a lot. It is doable. There will always be some noise, but I think everyone's pretty confident that right now unemployment is well above its long run average. And we could argue about whether in a state it should be 4% or 5%, but once we hit 8, 9, 10%, there's no debate. So that's one possibility. That would require, in many cases, changing the balanced budget requirements, including state constitutional amendments. That's hard. One thing that may be easier is requiring bigger rainy day funds in good times, which would mean there's more to run down in bad times. Kim indicated that we're kind of lucky, at least for this fiscal year, that state rainy day funds were large enough to kind of cushion the blow, for at least this fiscal year. But next fiscal year, 7% is good in rainy day funds, is really good in historical perspective. It's nowhere near the size of the budget shortfall we're facing now. But we could say, we can make ourselves, we can bind our hands to say, when unemployment is at this level, is at its natural long run level, we're running surpluses. And so we're gonna build up rainy day funds equal to 20, 30, 40% of typical expenditures, even more perhaps. What that would do is give a lot of leeway in times like these, not just for one fiscal year, but even over multiple fiscal year, to kind of cushion the adjustment and to avoid making the recession worse by immediately raising taxes and cutting spending. So we want to avoid that. It's an economic policy disaster. Anything we can do over the long run to change the requirements that make states do that would make for really good policy. I realize that this is a tall ask. It's very much a long run goal. It will be hard to enforce, but it is entirely predictable, not that we would have COVID, but that states would be in this incredibly painful position in a recession. And there are things we could do to make it less likely. So as I said, there are lots more ideas along both of these lines in the book that I really would be honored to speak with any of you about at length. But I want to thank you all for listening and thank SSLF for the opportunity. Thank you all.
Thank you, Yael. We'll now go to some Q&A. Again, if you have a question for our presenters, please click the Q&A tab located on the bottom of your screen and then write in your question. Thank you. We have received a few questions, and one for Yair that came in about when you were talking about unemployment. So how can you charge certain corporate companies more on the unemployment tax versus other? Isn't that discriminatory? Why isn't that discriminatory?
Well, first of all, we already do that. Experience rating does exactly that. They pay different unemployment insurance taxes. One thing you could do, for example, is to pool more of the risk so that there's less of a disparity than there currently exists in unemployment insurance tax rates. So it's more like pure insurance where the risk of a recession is pooled. So one way to reform unemployment insurance taxes is by making unemployment insurance taxes more similar across employers within a given state rather than less similar. Wow. So it could actually work the other way.
I would actually, right, I feel like partly the reason I don't actually would think that they might be too similar, because there are certain industries that use unemployment insurance as a way to deal with seasonality in their industries. And so you want to be able to insure people over a seasonal cycle. I totally agree with the idea that you don't want to use what's going on right now as a way to affect experience rating. But I feel like in some ways having variation is important, because otherwise the idea that you're going to lay people off and have the government sort of pick up the cost of those months that you don't want them employed becomes harder if you have less different.
I agree with you, Kim, and I would say that there's a good argument to be made that there should be a steeper curve of experience rating most of the time.
Right.
And so we want, like for seasonal differences, as you indicated, I think experience rating works very well. It just doesn't work well for business cycle level variation. So, but right now we kind of treat those under one rubric. And I think we'd be better off kind of disentangling them.
Right. And one of the things that happened this time, which would give me encouragement that we could separate what we're seeing right now from other things. Like as this all began and we were shutting companies and the economy down, states and the federal government were actually really good at relaxing a number of the requirements that were in place for the social safety net. So basically not having people looking for jobs when we don't want them leaving their houses. And so there is some room and flexibility. And if you would ask me in the fall, I would have thought that maybe I would have been more encouraged that we could actually adopt some things that seem more smart. But as we haven't gotten another stimulus level, I don't really understand what's going on here in DC.
Thank you. Another question for this question for you, for you, Kim. What's the benefit of using cumulative initial claims to yield 55 million unemployment compensation claims, given that this doesn't mean that 55 million different people file for unemployment compensation?
And partly what we do is we use the initial claims and then we use the ongoing numbers as we go out in time. Partly there are other tools that are available that try and do the individual, like partly what we were trying to do when we introduced this back this fall was in part measure what this looked like in terms of the strain on unemployment offices at the state level. And so the point that this is not, there are not this many people unemployed at any one point. It's more just sort of measuring where we are at a certain point, and we sort of are given what that trajectory looks like. So in certain states, it's down lower. But I take the point that we could be using different things. We don't actually have the data, at least we physically don't. There are some people who have done a better job, some of the people at Harvard, in terms of trying to match claims to other information we have on individuals so that you could actually have the number of people who are unemployed. The unemployment rate number and the employment rate number, where we have different statistics that can answer part of these questions, and none of them are perfect. And so partly what we were doing is we were trying to get an in real time measure of what was going on with the action when we were doing something that was totally unprecedented, which was basically saying all of these businesses needed to shut down, and some of that translated into people being laid off.
If I could just relate this to something that many of you probably know that I think is very much consistent with Kim's point, that state unemployment insurance offices and systems were overwhelmed because they were getting really unprecedented number of claimants, but still trying to apply rules that kind of made sense most of the time. But you know, going through the entire procedure when you have, you know, an order of magnitude 10 times more claimants than you've ever had before is just impossible. So something had to give. And one thing that I think states did some of, but could have done more, is maybe tweaking the rules more along the lines of what Kim said earlier, in terms of like, so, you know, for this month, we might have an expedited procedure or something like that.
And so part of it was also just keeping up. The other thing, and on the tool on our website, we present information state by state. And so while overall the number is very dramatic, there are certain states that aren't anywhere near the cumulative amount that we saw in the Great Recession. And so part of this was also trying to highlight how fast and how steep the level of unemployment was this time versus other recessions, right? It isn't necessarily that we have more people unemployed overall over the whole period. It's the fact that it happened so fast. And then now we're just sort of trying to push up and sort of use this information with the information from the unemployment rates in different states to highlight how this is changing and how it might change, especially if COVID cases go back up this fall.
Okay, thank you. This question is for you, but Kim, please feel free to comment as well. You said that in 2017, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act has hampered the federal government's ability in fighting the economic downturn. Please explain how or what you mean by that.
So the TCJA instituted a lot of in a quest to raise revenue. It instituted a lot of what I call automatic destabilizers that can make recessions worse. Now, happily, the CARES Act suspended a lot of them. So, but it required work. So, some of the examples that I would emphasize would be, so for example, the limits on NOL refunds, which was, so TCJA said in a quest to raise revenue and limit the 10-year expected budget deficit, said we are getting rid of NOL carrybacks, that all net operating losses, if a business has a loss, they're not getting a check from the government this year. Instead, they're going to pay lower taxes next year. From a business cycle perspective, NOL carrybacks were great because you got a business that had paid taxes last year would get a check from the government now, precisely when they need it. So that was a really nice property. Getting lower taxes later when we're out of this recession is much less appealing from a business cycle perspective. So what that means is that that part of TCJA was a business cycle disaster. Now, in the CARES Act, what did they do? They got rid of that part of NOL carrybacks. Now, so I'm happy about that.
Wait,
they allowed NOL carrybacks very generously, actually. It was very easy to claim refunds. So that's good from a business cycle perspective, but A, it required Congress to do a lot of work at a time when Congress's efforts, energy, et cetera, were incredibly valuable. And B, kind of make a mockery of the 10-year budget targets. If you're going to change things, if you're going to change revenue raisers precisely when they actually start really raising revenue, then it's not good governance. But I was very happy to see this. With that said, I was very happy to see this. There's a bunch of other things that also worked along those lines that the CARES Act also changed.
Right. And so the other point, and where I thought you were going, is also, we cut revenues that the federal government received by $1 trillion while we were at the height of our recovery. And so if you think that at some point deficits matter, I'm not quite sure when that matters now. As an economist, I still believe at some point the federal government needs to raise as much money over some period of time that they're going to end up spending. And by basically losing that $1 trillion then, that's why we're at $3 trillion now, right? In general, we think about, historically running deficits at the federal level when we're at war, when we have recessions, makes sense because we can make it up during boom periods. The fact that we had some of the greatest deficits at a point when we're at sort of the high point of this recovery, albeit it was sort of a long, slow recovery, makes it kind of problematic to figure out how you're going to do something like stimulus when you come across something that is a recession. And, you know, and I applaud them for doing what they did in terms of putting it more off to the side and spending another $2 trillion. But, you know, we are talking real money. And at some point, we are going to need enough revenues coming in to kind of cover the amount of money we're spending.
Just to echo, Kim is, you know, that's a much more broader and important point than what I was saying. And it really is like, we didn't keep our powder dry. So remember, like the macroeconomic model is deficits in recessions, but not deficits or even surpluses in booms. We have taken that to mean high deficits in booms and even higher deficits in recessions. Who knows how long that's sustainable?
Right. The other thing to sort of think about when we're talking about federal policy and TCJA, well, whatever happens in the election is going to potentially change what federal taxes look like going forward, depending on who wins. Even if that doesn't happen, because of the way that TCJA was written, all of the changes on the personal side are scheduled to expire and go back to the old way of doing things in 2025. And so that was done to meet this 10-year budget window. But it does mean that there is a lot of uncertainty, and especially for places that key off of the federal tax system, this can be a real issue. One of the things that happened with those net operating loss carrybacks is they didn't only change it for this year, they changed it for the prior 2 years. We spent a lot of time talking to Colorado, trying to figure out whether that meant that they would need to like refigure out what their Tabor rule is if you had less revenue in from those years. So I spent a lot of time, and this is not a clear thing to figure out. I think in the end, they made the right decision that like they decoupled and said that you could not go back and change your 2018 taxes to reflect what was going on in Colorado, even though the federal government was suddenly saying you could sort of go backwards in time and lower your tax bill.
And Kim, actually, that was part of the second part of my question was going to be, states are decoupling primarily because of the retroactive aspects of some of the provisions in the CARES Act, because states are saying, why should we have to pay out for 2018, 2019 when the economy was booming, everything was fine? So now we're taking that out of our existing funds and we don't have it.
And that's right. And it made sense at the federal level because really what they were trying to do is get more money to businesses. But at the state level, especially given the balanced budget rules, figuring out what that meant for prior year's balanced budget rules and also what it meant for your cash at hand, especially when states needed to figure out what their cash at hand was going to be starting July 1st when their new budget year started, even though all of their income tax revenue wasn't necessarily going to be in until July 15th. And so I can't, like, the amount of times I was trying to talk to people at the federal level and explain to them why it would have been incredibly helpful if they were going to pass something to do it in May or June so states could put it into their next year budget, just didn't register at all. But it did make what you had all had to do this June and July is just extraordinary to me and unprecedented, which is sort of funny given we went through the Great Recession saying, oh, this is the biggest recession ever since the Great Depression. Nothing's ever going to be like this. And yet here we are, and I feel like it's so much worse.
So should we expect more states to decouple in the next few months or when they look at this issue?
I think what we see, and we saw some of this in the Great Recession where some states started decoupling from bonus depreciation. I think states are realizing that in the trade-off between simplicity for people filling out their taxes, which happens is if you're following what the federal government is doing, and being able to predict and have stable income, states are going to need to decouple more, right? Part of it is if we had a federal tax code that in policy reflected what the law was, rather than have all of these things that sort of have these sort of fake deadlines when they're going to expire, but they never expire because the federal government is just sort of trying to push the ball down a year or two. It makes it really hard to do what states need to do. And so I do think for specific provisions, we'll see states trying to figure out, and I feel like they should figure out what it means for their budgets and for their people. So for their populations, what makes the most sense.
Thank
I could
you.
just jump in here. I
Sure.
think one point that Kim is making right here is that what we see here is one underappreciated problem with discretionary fiscal policy at the federal level, when you do it in the moment, is that it has like these rebound effects on the states, where if you're trying to project and make budgets and things like this, and at any moment the feds may change things, well, that just makes policy really difficult for you. While if it's more stable, even if it's more countercyclical, at least you know in advance how to respond to it. Now, that doesn't help state legislators that much, but I think it's an underappreciated point at the federal level.
I feel like state legislators know this. It's more that like getting the federal legislators or getting the people once they leave state government and go to the federal government to remember it is the key important part.
State legislators, when they go to Congress, remember their former experience for the first term or two, but by the third term, they basically look at their state legislative experiences. I didn't know then what I know now. That's what I heard from members of Congress who were former state legislators over the last 20 years. It's interesting. But I want to thank both of you for taking the time to answer some questions. We have other questions, but would probably go to 5 o'clock or longer. And we do need to end just about now. So I'm going to turn it over to Steve to close up the program. Thank you. Thank you, Kim. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
With an awful lot of material and information to unpack. I was trying to kind of sort through some of the key points that both of you were making in your very fine presentations. And by the way, let me point out to everybody listening here that this full presentation today will be available on our website tomorrow. And we can provide you with access to all of the slides. And for your very gracious invitation, Yar and Kim, to speak with legislators subsequent to this program about some of the issues that are going on, I encourage all of the legislative leaders listening here to take a good advantage of the skills and expertise that both of these folks bring to this discussion. So I admit I'm confused a lot by trying to understand and decipher where we are economically speaking and what we can forecast for the future, because we certainly don't know yet the course of this virus. We don't know, we're trying to measure what the likely impact of this will be on our state economies as well as the national economy, and you could certainly extrapolate to the world economy. But yet, there's not enough data in it, doesn't seem to me, to be able to make the kinds of clear projections of what is in front of every state legislature come January. But I think that you've provided some guidance with a roadmap, with some of the indicators that we should be looking at. I think that there is value in examining what occurred during the last, what we call the Great Recession, which brings to mind, what are we going to call this? What's the name of this one going to be? If that was the Great Recession, is this the really crazy Great Recession? Or are we in that D territory where we're looking at? So there's a lot confronting us. Tomorrow we will continue the discussion. We will dive a little deeper into kind of the gritty part of this, and we will talk about specific strategies that states can consider. What's in their tool chest? What can they bring to bear in the future when they come in January and try to help us dig out of this morass? But again, I appreciate very much you taking time out to be with us and talk about a difficult subject that's going to be increasingly high up on our radar screen in upcoming months. So I thank you and I thank all of our participants. I certainly wish you all good health and be careful, and we'll get out of this working together. Thank you.